So today on this episode of Ask Judge Man, we're going to talk about floodgates, specifically Rivalry of the Warlords, Gozen match, and There Can Only Be One. So if you're new to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel, my name is Benji, and I am not an official judge, but I do actively make every effort I can to understand the rulings and interactions between as many cards as possible in the meta so that I do not misplay. So in order to avoid people beating you, it is good to know as much as you can. So let's start this discussion by discussing Rivalry of the Warlords. Now this card's very interesting. It's one of the only cards that actually has an official ruling FAQ from Konami, and it will be linked down below in the description. Rivalry of the Warlords is a continuous trap card that says each player can only control one type of monster. Send all other face-up monsters they control to the graveyard. So when this card successfully resolves, both players have to look at their field. Based on the current number of different types of monsters on the field, they'll do one of three things. If they control no monsters, they will do nothing. If they control one type of monster, they will do nothing. If they control more than one type of monster, they need to select one of the types of monsters that are currently on the field, and then send all other types of monsters that they have to the graveyard. So if you currently have a dragon, a warrior, and a spellcaster, you will have to select one of those types. Let's say you select dragon. You'll then have to send all of your warrior and spellcaster monsters that are currently face up on your field to the graveyard. Gozen match is a continuous trap card that says each player can only control one attribute of monster. Send all other face-up monsters they control to the graveyard. So it's essentially the same card except for whether you have a light, a dark, and a fire type monster. You'll have to select one of those attributes and then send the remaining ones to the graveyard. And finally we have There Can Only Be One, which is a continuous trap card that says that each player can only control one monster of each type. If a player controls two or more monsters of the same type, they must send some to the graveyard, so they control no more than one monster of that type. So in this case, if you happen to control 3 worm-type monsters, you'd have to select one worm-type monster and send all other ones to the graveyard. That's even if you have 2 worms and a dragon, you'll have to send one of your worms to the graveyard. All of these floodgate effects are very similar in how they work, so this FAQ that we're going to be going through does apply to all 3 cards simultaneously. So we know what happens when these cards are on the field, but what actions are you allowed to take while these floodgates are in play? That tends to be where the bulk of the confusion comes from when it comes to these cards. So there are certain actions you can perform and certain actions you cannot perform, and we're going to discuss those now. So you're not allowed to attempt to summon a monster that would violate the current game state based on whichever one of these floodgates you currently have. So if you have Rivalry of the Warlords and you currently control a warrior, you're not allowed to attempt to even perform any kind of a summon whatsoever if it would give you a monster that is not a warrior. You can activate a card that would summon a monster that is of the type that you currently control, such as Monster Reborn, although perhaps you're trying to give your opponent a kaiju monster, which you cannot do under Rivalry of the Warlords unless the monster they currently control is of the type of the kaiju in which you are giving them. Even though there are a tremendous amount of restrictions on what you can summon under these cards, you can always set monsters while any of these cards is up, because the type and attribute of a monster is not public knowledge, so there's nothing that says you can't place them face down. Although there are rules in relation to what happens to them should they be flipped face up while you already control a monster of a particular type that might be conflicting with one of the cards. So if Rivalry of the Warlords is currently active and you have a face-up warrior monster, but you've set in a rock monster and your opponent declares battle against the rock monster, after damage calculation the monster is considered to be flipped. So the monster at that point would be sent to the graveyard, because any monster that comes to your field after you've already selected the type that you're currently going to control, in this case warrior, will be sent to the graveyard by the effect of Rivalry of the Warlords. So the flip happens at the start of the damage step, but its flip isn't really resolved until damage calculation. So after damage calculation, the monster will be sent to the graveyard, even if it were not destroyed by the battle. And if it were to go sent to the graveyard this way, it's not considered to be destroyed. That's just the reason most people currently play these cards, that Rivalry of the Warlords, Gozen match, and There Can Only Be One doesn't actually destroy a card, it just sends them to the graveyard. If you do flip a monster by battling it, and it is sent to the graveyard by the effect of There Can Only Be One, it would still activate its flip effect, because it was considered to have been flipped face up, which is the only way it would have been affected by Rivalry of the Warlords, or There Can Only Be One, or Gozen match. Now, I already said that you can attempt to summon a monster of a different type or attribute, but there are tricks around this. Should you be playing a deck such as Cosmo, which is mostly psychic and machine-based, the psychic pilots have the ability to banish themselves as cost to remove themselves from the field so that you can summon a higher level Cosmo monster from your hand to the field. Now, if you currently control a Cosmo Farm Girl and then activate Cosmo Farm Girl's effect to banish itself, as long as there was a psychic type monster in your hand, you can legally activate its effect to summon a monster from your hand. If you only controlled a machine, if you only had a machine in your hand, it would be illegal to activate this effect. But if you have a psychic in your hand, you can trigger the effect of Cosmo Farm Girl to summon perhaps your Cosmo Wicked Witch. But now at this point you don't currently control a Psychic type monster, so if you did have a machine in your hand, you would be allowed to summon it, but it would become questionable to your opponent whether or not you're doing that legally or illegally. Now, they're not actually allowed to assume you're cheating and ask a judge to verify, although what can happen is, let's say someone does cheat and use this strategy to help them summon a machine when they couldn't actually do that, and you did find out the cards in their hand and determine that they had made an illegal play, that would be grounds for potential cheating penalty. At this point, we've covered pretty much all you need to know in order to make decisions and make plays around Gozen Match and Rivalry of the Warlords, although more recently people have been reminded that there is a second important fact that's mentioned in this FAQ, and the only reason why this is allowed is because Konami says so, which is, am I allowed to activate Mind Control, or a card that would take control of my opponent's monster, if it's not the same type of the monster I control? Now, my gut instinct would be no. Why would you be allowed to attempt to take control of a monster that you know you can't take control of? But the FAQ says you can. If you would take control of a monster, or you would somehow have a monster that is not of the type that you're allowed to control at the particular moment, perhaps you already have a warrior, but you activate Mind Control to take control of a Cyverse monster, you will take control of it, and then by the effect of Rivalry of the Warlords, you will have to then send the Cyverse monster to the graveyard. Matter of fact, whichever one you receive second, in addition to the monster you've originally selected the type for, is the only one that can be sent to the graveyard by this. So it's the same thing that happens with a kaiju under Remove Brainwashing. Should you give your opponent a kaiju and you activate Remove Brainwashing and you give them another kaiju and it doesn't match the type, since you can only control one kaiju, the second one goes to the graveyard by game mechanics. And that ruling is actually based on the ruling originally made in the FAQ by Konami on Mind Control under Rivalry of the Warlords. Now, there are a couple other little details we might want to mention here. First is that if you activate a card that could potentially summon a monster of the correct type or attribute, you are allowed to activate it, such as the Cosmo Farm Girl scenario we talked about before. There's similar ones with Gladiator Beasts. You can potentially activate the effect of one Gladiator Beast to shuffle it into the deck if there is a legal target in the deck to summon, and once it removes itself from the field, you can summon something else. You can also activate Monster Gate if you control a light-type machine, and if your deck contains light-type machines, in the potential that it could come up, but now that you don't control a monster, you could potentially summon another light-type machine. You could even activate Reasoning, whether or not the monster that comes up is like an Ash Blossom under this scenario where you might control a Cyber Dragon. If you came up as a Ash Blossom, it would just go to the graveyard by game mechanics instead of being summoned, but that doesn't mean you can't activate the card. Another interesting scenario that can occur is that you could potentially activate a card that summons two different types or attributes of monsters depending on which of the floodgates you're currently under. That might restrict you. So if under Rivalry, you could potentially activate a Soul Charge to summon back all the different types of monsters that are currently in your graveyard if you have no types of monsters on the field. And the reason that's important is that when they are successfully summoned, the effect of Rivalry will then become valid and send all of the different types to the graveyard until you control only one. But you could summon more than one. You are allowed to activate an effect that would summon multiple cards of different types and attributes at the same time if you currently control no monsters, because you currently haven't selected a type of monster. So that is allowed. Now, if you found this useful, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for additional episodes of the Ask Judge Man series, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you for stopping in.